welcome. My name is Chris Ajemian. I'm the CEO and founder of Kate's Tutoring and Educational Services and your co-host for today. I hope you're doing well. Once again, joined by the magnificent Michael Muska, a dear friend and mentor who's worked in admissions in Brown, Cornell, Oberlin, amongst many other offices, and now runs Relativity College Counseling out of New York City. Michael, thanks for joining us again. We've already sort of chit-chatted, but just officially, how are you doing today?
Always a pleasure to be with you, Chris, and hello to all our faithful followers. I guess this is kind of the fourth one of these we've done together, so which is great. So, yep.
Cool. So again, our housekeeping, like we like to go through, I'll facilitate the conversation. If you have any questions at any point in time, please put them in the Q&A panel, not the chat thread, the Q&A panel, which you can access by scrolling over at the bottom of your screen. Also, for the best experience, we recommend that you put your screen set to gallery view, which you can do by scrolling over the top right corner of your browser and selecting gallery. You may also want to click view options, which is at the top of your screen, and you can select something called side-by-side modes that Michael and I appear side-by-side on your screen, and next to the slides that we'll use to run today's session. So speaking of today's session, here's what we're looking at. So what makes a school a good fit? How do I find schools suited to me? How do I build a rounded strategic list? How do I demonstrate interest to schools? And then Q&A. And one of the things that Michael and I are going to do our best today to accomplish is to kind of get through points 1 through 4 fairly quickly. There were a ton of questions in our last webinar about a week and a half, well, 2 weeks ago, really. And we did our best to cover them. We also followed up with individual emails to answer questions, but there's just a lot of questions on the subject of selecting schools for your school list, especially in the age of COVID. And we want to make sure that we get to those today. So we're going to try and do about half and a half today with slides and Q&A. So hopefully that works for you. And then if there is a question that comes up that you don't feel comfortable asking during the session, you're always welcome to reach out to us directly. Either via phone or via email. You can contact us at the Kate's office or Michael directly at Relativity College Counseling. Here it is there for you. We'll also bring this information back at the end of the session, but just so you have that freedom. And we're always happy to answer any question. No question is too big, too small, too smart, or not smart. Michael, let's start with a quick update like we always do. What's going on in admissions? I'm happy to talk about what's going on in testing. What's going on in admissions since we last spoke 2 weeks ago, Michael?
I think one of the biggest things that happened was that about a week and a half ago, Princeton announced that they were eliminating early action and only having regular admission applications. I think a lot of us wondered if there would be an instantaneous follow-up by other schools. It's been relatively quiet. So it's a Princeton only decision at this point. So we'll just have to wait and see if other schools do decide to make some changes. One of Princeton's reasons for doing it was they wanted to see more of the students' record because they lost last spring. And by applying regular, they would have a chance to see an entire semester of work this fall. I think there's a good logic to it, but at the same time, it's a radical change for Princeton. And it will be interesting because Princeton, Harvard, Yale, and Stanford shared a single choice early action policy between them, which now will certainly be changed because Princeton is no longer in that group. So that's one thing that I think we've seen. And then obviously watching some of these opening decisions in terms of what colleges are going to be doing for this fall certainly doesn't impact our group here applying, but to see what's happening and then also listening what's happening in their own school districts. New York City just announced today what they're planning to do. And it's a real hodgepodge in terms of what people are putting out there, and there's no clarity. And then finally, the thing that I think concerns a lot of us is the Trump government announcement from ICE that international students may not be allowed into the country if they only have the opportunity to be doing online courses. And Harvard and MIT have actually filed a suit already to contest that, to make sure that we'll see what will happen. But obviously, it's a quick update, but there's so many things that are constantly changing. It's important to be in touch with people to make sure you know what's happening.
Thanks for that, Michael. I'll just simply add from a testing standpoint, virtually every single school in America right now is test optional, with the exception of MIT. They seem to be hanging on to the SAT, ACT requirement for this COVID admission cycle. And, that's opened up a lot of doors For a lot of students who either, in the past would have loved to have applied to these schools, didn't have the scores for them. And so it's going to be a very interesting sort of year in admissions. We're going to probably see a lot more applications at all the different schools because of the test optional policy. And, one more thing I'll say about that, and this sort of like leads me into the next piece of this, which is, this really kind of informs, again, I'll do a review of the admissions criteria so we're all on the same page. This really kind of influences how your entire application is going to be looked at. So most people on this call have already seen this, but I'll go through it again quickly to kind of make this point. So the rough order of importance of admissions criteria are going to be your, number one, your transcript. So your grades and the level of rigor of the classes that you took, as well as your predictions on your leaving tests if you're international, whether it's A levels or IB. Number two, again, test scores. Number three, your resume, or your CV, all your different activities. Number four, your recommendations, your counselor recommendation, your two teacher recommendations, and then also your essays, personal essays, school supplements. And also, again, this year, the interviews have probably become even more important. So for people who are asking questions about how test scores and how admissions are going to be influenced by test optional policies, basically items, 1, 3, 4, 5, and 6 are going to be taking a much greater importance this year. Michael, anything to add before we actually jump into the agenda?
I guess I would add to that though, Chris, is that I was interviewing a couple students yesterday, one who had a 36 on the ACT and one who had a 35 on the ACT. And clearly a student who has had the opportunity to take the tests can share those with colleges. And we're not going to say that colleges aren't going to penalize the student who couldn't, but they could advantage the student who did have the opportunity to take them. So even though it may not be in that number 2 spot, as you kind of said, in terms of some of the other considerations, if you've got a score and it's a good score, make sure you share it.
Yeah, just to sort of touch upon that a little bit, we talked in one of our webinars a few weeks ago that we think, especially because of all the uncertainty, the more you have the criteria and all the criteria that they're used to seeing, the more confident they're going to be in their own decision-making process, right? So,
yep, no question.
Cool. So factors to consider. What makes a good fit? So Michael, I have brought up a couple of things here, a couple of points. I want to quickly make these points and then basically let you just sort of take the lead and talk. So
sure.
I always say to people, ask what's most important to you now, but also in the next 60 years. So number one, the major, what do you want to actually study? 2, location, suburban, urban, how far from home do you want to be? 3, size, both in terms of student body on the campus, as well as student teacher ratio. Flexibility, core curriculum, open curriculum. Do you want to have opportunities to do research as a freshman? Does that mean you have to go to a research university where freshmen can actually do that? What are the study abroad options? How flexible are your learning options? And then the social, sports. How much of a sports team do you want? How much of a rah-rah school do you like? Greek system, do you want to even be a part of that? And also, what are the questions regarding the cultural and political factors of the social scene of the campus and the students who are usually there? And then sort of finally, from a career aspect, the alumni network, what are these people doing? How much access do you have to them? And also, how strong is your career services office? So Michael, these are just sort of 6 of the major sort of buckets on factors to consider on, what makes a school a good fit. We'd love to hear your insights on these.
I mean, obviously, Chris, you kind of put them right in a good context in terms of it. I think for a lot of students, the number 1 you've got on the list, major, is really interesting to think about because realistically, many, many students will change their major from what they think they're going to study when they first start in college. So it's important to think about this college has the major that I hope and that I want to study, but also perhaps in the background, and this can factor into the kind of school a student might decide to go to. Will there be other options if I decide I want to do something else? There are a lot of kids who go into engineering and realize after they've done a year of it, my God, I don't want to be an engineer. And in that situation, if you're at an engineering only school, that can be difficult, which might bode for thinking about a larger university with a really strong engineering program that has other programs. That being said, however, you also want to make sure that the school you're looking at has the major that you want. Lots of times students, pick a school based on prestige, the name of the school, whatever, but if you want to be an undergraduate business major, you might want to reflect on whether I'm better off looking at Penn and Cornell in the Ivy League who have the strongest undergraduate business programs? Or do I do a major in another area, perhaps in economics? And then think about what you would do with business in graduate school, But again, I think one of the things that's important is to see what the schools offer, make sure it has what you currently would like to study, but make sure there's an opportunity for a backup plan as well too. So that's my first thought in terms of a major. Chris, you add something?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of case in point. I went to Boston College for undergraduate. I entered pre-med and I exited a pre-med theater arts major. So I went from one extreme all the way to the other. And then, of course, went into the education business.
Mhm.
But your point's well made. I mean, you want to go somewhere where you can allow yourself to kind of grow and thrive and evolve, because that's the reality. One last thing on this, the students I work with right now, whenever they go to BU, so Boston University proudly says that 80% of their freshmen change their major over the course of their career. So exactly the points you're talking about, Michael.
Yeah, one of the things I'd add too is, Chris, you're putting up here, why are these important, but for the next 60 years? So many things are the skills that you learn during your time here.
Absolutely.
It may not necessarily be the major, but it's how you use the skills in terms of the major you're interested in, and being able in our society, knowing that professions that exist today may not be around 20 or 30 years from now, and building skills along the way are absolutely key. The second point we've got up here is location. We work with a lot of New York City kids, and it's very obvious that to them, they might want to stay in an urban environment, but some of them might want to try something really different. So to think about, what's okay and what's not okay. I think the other piece is in terms of what's going on currently with the COVID situation. Some kids are now a little bit more inclined to stay closer to home. Typically a kid might say, California, no big deal. Now, and particularly looking at the COVID numbers in California as well too, this might be a concern that maybe I'm a little bit safer being closer to home, especially since, New York and Massachusetts and New Jersey and Connecticut seem to have this situation much better under control than a lot of other places in the country right now. So I think location is absolutely important in terms of that. But again, like I say, a kid who's lived in the city all his life may want to be out in the country in a beautiful, bucolic campus where they can just kind of relax, knowing they're going to come back to New York for their spring breaks, their Christmas breaks, their summers, and also maybe perhaps after college. But a kid who also really thrives in New York City life might want to be in Boston, Philadelphia, DC, LA, or Chicago. So I think that's something to think about in terms about location.
The only thing I'd say from my perspective that would be different is not different, just, to add, is I work with a lot of international students. The East Coast is where a lot of these students want to go simply because of travel time.
Yep. Though I would add my international crowd is more in the Far East, and they want to be in California. So it really depends the kind of clientele. You're working with all kind of the Brits, some Greeks kids, things like that. East Coast makes more sense for them, I agree. So, yeah. So size. I think lots of times you want to balance off what are you looking for in terms of size. What we mentioned before about major, a larger school is probably going to have more opportunities in terms of lots of classes, that if for some reason you want to switch a major and switch into something else, that's great. But many large schools are going to teach large lecture classes where your introductory class in psychology might have 200 kids in the class with a lecture up front and then breaking up into smaller groups. I'm not so sure that will be the norm right now in terms of the COVID situation. I think large lecture halls are going to become more useful because they can space students out in them rather than cram as many students into them as possible. So that could certainly change. But I think when you look at schools, see what the student to teacher ratio is. One thing that I think is really important in terms of that, see that the good teachers teach on the undergraduate level.
Absolutely.
There are a lot of great universities who will, claim all these great professors that they have on their campus who may only be teaching graduate students and doing research. So you want to make sure that the school you're talking about, there's a good student to teacher ratio, but also who's going to be teaching your classes. And I think when we talk about student body, it also adds in a little bit down on the social. What kind of student body do you want? If I'm an international student, do I want to go to a larger school with lots of other international kids? Do I want to be at a school where I can be my own self, to have a chance to be who I am? And I think lots of times students' experiences will be reflected by what they did in high school. I mean, if they were in a large high school, surprisingly, sometimes those kids want to be in a smaller college. For kids that are coming out of really tiny high schools, they may want that big experience, or as I talked to a student the other day, may want to continue with that smaller student to teacher ratio because they're used to having that support and that kind of contact.
So, Michael, years ago, um, you had a student at Poly Prep who I helped with her testing, and I learned a really incredible lesson in sort of watching how you advised her. You know, this was someone who was, socially awkward. She wasn't exactly going to let at the party, and I know that there was a lot of talk about her kind of going to say like a smaller school so she wouldn't get overwhelmed by the size of the university. But you had a whole different sort of take on it, which was, if I remember correctly, going to a larger school might actually make more sense because you can find smaller communities within that university. And if you're someone who's, you know, often searching for their community and who they're looking to connect with, at a large university, you have a lot more options. I'm not sure you remember that story, but that really kind of stuck with me.
No, I totally agree with you on that. That's why I say I think no one should ever shut the door. I think as students visit, see a large school, see a medium school, see a small school, get a feel for what it's like. It's tough right now because everything is, virtual tours and things like that. But I'm a firm believer that things are going to get better in the fall. And also, the other thing to think about, and I've always been an advocate of this respect as well too, the application process is a time to create opportunities. And I think if you get accepted to half a dozen schools, things will certainly be more normal, we all hope, next spring, that you can go visit these schools and then decide what's the better match for me as well too. We good? Okay.
Yeah.
Flexibility. I mean, obviously, one of the things you need to do and look at. I interviewed a student yesterday who's very excited about looking at Brown. The thing that's important to think about that is Brown has an incredibly open curriculum. And the thing that the student was excited about was they realized they could only take 32 to 40 courses during the time they're in college. And if they have to spend the first year and a half fulfilling core requirements, they've just lost a whole opportunity to take courses that they want to take. Other students want structure, a core curriculum that makes them sample lots of different things to make sure they have that kind of structure in terms of how they start off with before they pick a major, perhaps during sophomore year. So I think there's a real balance in terms of a student needs to think about what makes more sense for them. Student going into an open curriculum better be ready to make choices themselves without somebody telling them what to do, what direction they need. So I think in many ways, there are many students who are better suited for a core curriculum. So again, that's a piece of it. And you mentioned it in your opening remarks. Make sure if research is important to you, there are going to be research opportunities for undergraduates. The one downside, I think, for a lot of large universities is the research opportunities normally go to grad students, or if they're lucky, juniors and seniors. Some smaller universities, smaller colleges may let kids start doing research right away as a freshman. You want to ask about those opportunities. You want to ask about access in terms of the opportunity to do those things.
So two comments. Number one, a conversation I have every single year, multiple times, especially with international students, is, why Georgetown and Brown are their top two choices when those schools couldn't be more different in terms of curriculum, right?
Or Columbia and Brown.
Right, of course. You're going from one end of the spectrum of fairly rigorous, a lot of requirements, and some of them prescribed. In Columbia's case, they're telling you what classes you're taking freshman year for the most part, and then Brown is the complete other side of the spectrum where there are no requirements. It's really up to you. So that's just to say, for everybody out there who's listening and watching, you really need to do your research because these schools really are very, very different and very specific as far as the kind of learning experience that they offer. And you really need to be, kind of clear on what that is. And one more thing on research. So when we say research, we don't mean like you're in a lab, testing animals. Research means different things. And to me, what it means is really this idea of it's opportunity to go really deep into subjects that you love and to contribute to the professional knowledge base. One of the things that I was really surprised by when I did my graduate work, even at, as somebody who's like kind of mid-career, I didn't realize how much I loved research.
Mhm.
and how much I love is kind of throwing myself into these different areas and domains that I was really passionate about. So, if the term research means something to you that might be a turnoff, actually, it's really more of an opportunity to go, again, further in your intellectual inquiry, deeper into your passions, and to really contribute something, whether it's to a paper or to a study or whatnot, and it's phenomenal on the resume.
Yeah, one of the
So,
things I highlight, I've worked with a number of students who do the IB curriculum. And in the IB curriculum, they're required to do a research project for their graduation requirement in the IB. And I always highlight the talents that they learn to utilize during that will pay off in college, no matter what their major is. And so you're absolutely right. There's that, when you hear the word research, you think about being in a lab. Research is developing those tools that you're going to use in college in many areas and used later on in life as well.
100%.
Good. Social. I was fortunate early in my career. I was a big time college track coach. I actually coached at Auburn University in the Southeastern Conference. And I have to say it was one of the biggest highlights of my life.
Coach of the year twice, Michael. You were coach of the year
Twice at
at
the Southeastern
SEC.
Conference. And when we won the SEC in cross country one year, they introduced the team in front of 80,000 people in the football
Crazy.
stadium. I mean, crazy. So there are lots of kids who are diehard March Madness, college basketball, sadly didn't happen this year, but it's like the end all be all to lots of kids. Take a great school like Duke academically, and there are all these kids who become crazy when it comes into talking about college basketball.
Well, they're
So
called the Cameron Crazies, right?
Cameron crazies, exactly right. So I think in terms of it, thinking about, do you want that kind of aspect as part of your life? Or am I perfectly happy with a nice, quiet Division III school where a bunch of kids go out and watch Amherst and Williams play each other in football? It's perfectly fine. You have up there the Greek system. I think it's important for students to think about what's important for them in terms of the aspects of kind of the social world of what a college is going to be like. I use the Ivy League again. I've been doing a lot of chatting with students these last couple of days, but a place like Dartmouth, a place like Cornell, a place like Penn have very extensive Greek systems. But you mentioned Brown before, Columbia, they don't have large Greek systems. They're places where a kid maybe creates and develops their own social life. So I think that's important in terms of that aspect. Funny thing, yesterday I was talking again to another student about Brown. What's interesting is the political piece. Yes, there's a perception that a lot of schools are very liberal, in terms of what they do. But there's a Young Republicans Club at Brown.
Of course.
So in terms of, you want to look at and see what is the basis of what the school is all about, but also make sure that there's an ability for other kinds of expression, the ability that you still be who you are, and a lot of what the culture of the school is all about. And again, what bothers me during the COVID time is to get that feel when you're on a campus. It's much harder to achieve right now, but do your homework and it can be done.
Yeah, and it's interesting too how the social opportunities or the social characters of a school can really help to define your list. Because one of the things that was really important to me as I was going through my undergraduate research and school visits and whatnot was I really wanted big time sports, but I also didn't want a Greek system. I came from a high school that was very competitive, very, very cliquey. And I frankly was just like burnt out and just didn't want to have to deal with that, which is why Boston College for me, even though it was like the third best school on my list, if you will, that I was accepted to, it was actually the best fit because it really attended to those two particular characteristics really importantly. It's funny too, you mentioned the Young Republicans Club or the Republican Club at Brown. My brother, Peter, he went to Wesleyan, which is, a very progressive school. He was recruited to play football there. And then he was also the president of DEEC, the Republican, organization on campus. So he was actually the outsider in a place that's defined by outsiders, ironically.
But he had a great experience there, right?
He had a great experience there, and he now he's basically on the terrorist intelligence team for NYPD. He helps to stop all the different attacks that may or may not be happening in New York City. So he's also switched his political affiliations, just so that's also clear. But moving on to next then, career, Michael. What do you got?
It's really interesting. When I was at Oberlin, they had a line that you were an OB for life. And I think a lot of that had to do with career services, is that, they were really supportive in terms of helping students get ready to go out in the real world in terms of prepping them for job interviews, having people come to campus to recruit them for potential jobs, but also making sure that students there understood that they would continue to work with them in the future, that when there was a change in their career, perhaps a change in something they wanted to do, they were still there. And I think you can make sure that you want to identify these things exist at the schools that you're looking at. Will you continue to be part of that school's family for life? Will they continue to support you? Will they continue to help you? What kind of alumni network do they have in the area that you're going to come to? I mean, you come to New York and there's a Brown club, there's a Penn club, there's a Princeton club, there's a Yale and a Harvard club, there's a Cornell club, and many of them have physical buildings in the city. So you have this network of people that you're always connected to post-college, in addition to what you're able to start once you're at the school.
Yeah, I'll add a few things that, funny enough, a business development group that I'm a part of in New York City actually meets at the Cornell Club, which is over on like 44th, right by Grand Central. And it's an amazing place to go. But also, if you're an alum of the school, you don't need to actually live in the city to have access to the club. So as a Harvard University alumni, even though I don't live in New York City anymore full time, I'm still able to actually have membership at the club in New York and have access to it. And that goes for all the different kind of clubs around really the world. So like you're saying, there's an amazing network there, whether it's for business, personal, whatnot. And that's it's an important consideration. But the last thing I'll say about it is that, be careful of the marketing. One of the things that we're doing more and more at Cates is career advising. And the reason is because schools aren't getting it done. So while there are some schools that do have great career offices, there are other schools, I will not name them, but you've heard of them, where parents and students are finding it lacking. So my point is that do your best to also talk to students at these different universities, especially when it comes to career services support, because what might be sort of marketed to you in the website or sort of presented to you during orientation may not be in fact what it is in reality.
And what you have up there. How is this important to consider for the next 60 years? We're not just talking about immediately during graduation. We're not talking about a couple of years after college. We're talking about it for a lifetime.
There's a movement called the 6-year curriculum that two of my professors at Harvard are sort of spearheading. We actually may do a webinar on it in the coming months. And the skinny is that because people are living longer and because of all the disruptions, not COVID-19 related, although that's certainly now included, but because of technological advancement, people need to be shifting their careers over the course of, probably 60 years.
Chris?
So this idea of reskilling and going back to university, when they're like in their mid 40s or maybe even in their 60s to reskill and adapt to the changing context. So again, you're not making a decision for now, you're making a long-term decision. And these are very real points and, factors you have to consider. So, all right, Michael.
Chris, I'm 68 and I'm starting on a new job in the fall. So, come on. All right.
Well, there you go. There you have it. There you have it. Case in point. All right. So how to find best fit schools. Michael, this is a very simple concept.
Yep. I've always said this. I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Getting In. And I always say the first thing you got to do is look in the mirror and be honest with yourself. Right. Do I have the credentials for certain schools? Do these schools have the things that I'm looking for that we just discussed in the previous section? And that's going to be the kind of stepping off point in terms of how you approach this. Again, if I'm a weak student, I can't be looking at Ivy League schools, but if I'm a really strong student with strong credentials, with support from the school, have done lots of cool things, then you can probably say to yourself, okay, I'm a pretty good candidate for a real wide range of schools. And remember, we're going to talk a little bit about what we call targets and reach schools. Target and reach schools for certain kids can be very different than other kids. So the terminology we use basically is determined by how you looked at yourself in the mirror and realized what your qualities and credentials were.
Right. And just to sort of take this concept and relate it back to the last set of slides is that, you're doing that research on all the different schools and all those different characteristics, but you're doing, equally thoughtful and reflective research on yourself. Because it's going to be all about mutual fit.
Mhm.
right? And if you're somebody who's, looking at the Wharton School of Business because you think that, it's a great school to apply to, has an amazing name, if you haven't done anything in business, they're not going to take your application that seriously, right? So really, what are your assets? What are your experiences? What are the things that you truly love to do, right?
Yep.
You need to get really clear on that. And sometimes it's good to kind of have an outside voice, outside perspective on that.
Mhm.
Ask
Yep.
your parents, ask your school counselors, ask your peers, right? Your friends know you better than probably anybody, right? you know, Take that information and really have an honest, long look at, who you are, who you want to be, what impact you want to have in your community, because that's going to really help us with the next step.
And you used the word twice, fit, in this conversation, that these
Mm-hmm.
schools are going to be good fits for you, regardless of what level they fit on your list. So, yep.
Right, exactly. So putting it all together now, Michael, how to build a strategic list. You've already kind of given us a little, intel on this, but we talk about this idea of three buckets on
Mhm.
your list of anywhere from 8 to 12 schools, maybe a bit more in the COVID era because of all the uncertainty. But this idea of foundation, targets, and reaches. We'd love to kind of hear you talk about these from your perspective, and I'll add some comments as you go
Sure.
along.
I think there are a lot of students, who, they want to feel love. So they kind of feel like they should apply to a large group of what we call foundation. Some people use the word term safety. I like foundation because the word foundation means it's the foundation of your list. You
Right.
build up upon that list. As a foundation, you've got a couple schools that you feel very confident you're going to get into. And they should be important, but they need to be schools that you really see the fit, that you feel that you're comfortable with, that you would love to go to if things don't work out as well in the target and the reach schools. And again, I think, like I say, lots of times we talk about 10 schools, 12 schools, what's the important number to think about? I wouldn't load up in foundation schools. You find one or two you really love and you really like to go to, you don't need a whole bunch of others just because it might help your ego that you got more admits.
Right. Michael, can you talk about the 444 sort of theme and your thoughts on it?
Yeah, a lot of people think that's a good way to go. 4 in the foundation, 4 in the target, 4 in the reach, for 12 schools. I still think, like we just said, I think you can shift one or two of those over into target or to reach if you've got a couple foundation schools you really like. If you don't, if you need more foundation schools because you're just not sure, that's one thing. And we also talked about, and I don't know if it's in a later slide, but also a student who might need financial aid might need to look at their list a little bit differently. And if
Right.
financial aid is important, they might need an extra foundation or target school that does merit scholarships, because that's going to be important when they see what their financial aid packages look like.
Nice. The only thing I'd add to this is, if you really do your research and you find two schools that are, really interesting to you that you'd be happy to go, you're probably going to be fine. And one of the things that I'm going to talk about when we get into the target schools, I'm going to show you how I sort of organize foundations, targets, and reaches based off of test scores.
Mhm.
And I'll also simply add, as far as financial aid, because this is probably the slide we should talk about it, Michael. With financial aid, remember, if you are an international student with a US passport, you're like in the sweet spot
Mhm.
because you're competing with other international applicants coming out of your region, and therefore not with all the American students. Okay, so it's a smaller pool of applicants that you're sort of competing with. But secondarily, you're also in the U.S. financial aid pool, of which there's like exponentially more opportunity for you.
Yep.
So if you're thinking about what kind of passport to apply with, you're asking, I live overseas and I have a US passport, how does it help? It really helps with financial aid.
Yep.
Michael, any more color on that?
Yeah, I'd also add to that, Chris, too, is that an international student who's attending a school in the United States, say, for example, I used to be at Andover. Students from Andover, when they were looked at by the Brown admissions officer, who was me, I was looking at them in the context of the Phillips Andover pool, not
Right.
in the international pool. Okay. So they ended up getting a real plus in the admissions process because they're being looked at in this context of, I had 100 kids perhaps from Andover applied to Brown as opposed to 10,000 who were applying from China. Okay. So I think it's important in terms of thinking of the context in terms of where they could fall in terms of that. So that's a plus for that. To move on to targets, I think one of the misconceptions at times about targets, and we've talked about this in previous sessions, is you can't take your targets and you can't take your foundations for granted. You know,
Absolutely.
they want to know that you're really serious about them, that you've shown love, that you've shown interest. You know, we've covered a couple topics on how to do that in previous sessions, but I think that's really critical in it because a target can become a reach if you don't treat it right. And so I think that's important. But a target school is one where, as you just said a second ago, your grades, your scores, they fit the parameters of what that school normally looks for. And I think that makes a lot of sense.
Cool. And then just to sort of add to that, I have this in the slide, right? Find at least 4 schools where grades and scores fit the medians. And I often find it helpful for students to think about sort of where they are as far as a numerical fit, if you will, looking at some of the U.S. News and World Report data, some of it, right? And I'm going to demonstrate it in a second. Now, obviously, anything on U.S. News and World Report must be taken with a grain of salt, but it can give you some sense as to kind of, where you might be in the applicant pool. And so,
The one caution I will make, Chris, on that too is families sometimes will look at the medians and they see them falling on the lower part of it and they say, oh, we're okay with that school. Realize that the median, if you're on the higher level of the median, you're going to be in much better shape in terms of applying to that particular school. I'll use the example of Vanderbilt, where I went down there and visited a couple of years ago.
yeah.
And you go on, U.S. News and World Report, and you see this median for 25 to 75, and you're looking at 1,200 to 1,400. Well, you better be closer to 1,400 than 1,200 when they're going to start to look at you.
Yeah, and so hopefully you can see it. I brought up 3 schools here in U.S. News and World Report. I got UC Berkeley, which is a public university, right? University of Southern California, which even though it's in California, it's unlike UCB, it's actually a private university.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also have the beloved Georgetown University here, and I want to highlight the test score medians, right? And now I am assuming that you've got great grades. Because frankly, if you go into all these different schools and you drill down on their data, they're going to say that the average student has like a 4.0, right? So assuming that you've got like, A's, A pluses, or an IB of like anywhere from like a 30 probably into the 40s. Or if you're a UK student, you've got predictions of all A's or A stars. You can look at the test scores to give you a sense as to kind of where you fall. So like, for example, let's just take a student whose test score is let's just say it's a 30 for right now, okay? Usually, the closer your score is to either extreme helps you understand kind of where you're at, all right? So like, for example, if you're a student who has a 30 and you're right in the middle of the UCB sort of range, their average is really like a 31. So this is kind of like maybe in the Targetsville, probably Foundationville, okay? USC to 30, I mean, you're going to be a little less competitive there, all right? So this is going to be more of a reach for you, probably, okay? And Georgetown for sure is going to be a reach because you're outside of the lower band. However, if you're like Michael's students, who he was talking to the other day, who had 35s and 36s, you're above the 75th percentile for each of these score ranges, right? So you're probably, look, it's kind of hard to say that any school of this caliber is like a foundation or a target school, but you can feel much better about your chances at a UCB or a USC or a Georgetown with a 35 or a 36. So
let me add one big thing to that too, and using Berkeley as the example. There's a danger when you look at Michigan, Virginia, UNC, and Berkeley, public schools, because the lower part of their range is impacted by the fact that they have to take significant numbers of students from in-state, okay? Yep. Unfortunately, these schools don't post what the range is for their out-of-state applicants, which would be significantly higher.
So the way that I normally sort of position that for people is, the reason why you have a 6-point spread here, when it's usually like a 4 or a 3-point spread, if you will, is because of that in-state factor, okay? So, and that's another reason why like a state with like, a median or interquartile range from 20 to 34 is ranked 22 compared to a school that's ranked 24, because you have a lot of students from in-state who are coming. Now that said, if you're someone who's coming from out of state, and you're applying to a UCLA or UCB, you have to basically be, especially at Berkeley in particular, you have to be an Ivy League caliber candidate to be
Absolutely.
admitted. You have to really, that's what Michael's saying. You got to be more at the, say, at the 33, 34 range in order for them to like, look at you, and to see someone who's really kind of competitive. So Michael, any final thoughts on this? And we'll go back to the
And
slide.
one other danger, I know we have people in here who look at the California system.
Yeah.
The California state legislature, I think we mentioned this last time, has now voted that diversity can be a factor again in the California system, because they were noting how on the multicultural side, the numbers had really gone down in the California system. And that's going to impact out-of-staters, because there may fill more spots with in-staters that fit those criteria.
Right. And then just finally on this is that, yes, University of California school system, university system has gotten rid of testing. So just again, use what we're doing, what we're showing here, just to be as a point of illustration. It's not really about UC Berkeley specifically, but, schools where they haven't gotten rid of testing, forever, like they have at UCs.
Yep.
All right, cool. So then here, let me go back over then to our slides. Right. So back up over here on the targets, again, that's what I'm talking about in terms of medians, right? So if your ACT or SAT score is like smack in the middle, if it's in the average, it's probably going to be in the target range for you, okay? If your score is going to be at the upper bound, like 75th percentile and above, it's looking closer like target/foundation. If you're going to be, in the middle and then closer to the lower bound, especially for the top schools, it'd be probably more of the reaches. And so, Michael, with that, let's talk about reach schools.
Yeah, the interesting thing I want to start off with on the reach schools is a lot of students like to think that if they use their early decision application to their advantage, that their reach school gets easier to get into. And I think it's important to say that's a misconception. Your chances to get into a challenging, what would be a reach school, are still going to be challenging if you apply ED. Do you have a little bit of an edge? Maybe. But in terms of a school moving from target to reach from reach to target because you went ED, or becoming easier to get into as a reach school, I'm not sure I would buy into that. Okay, so that's one piece I would say in particular. I think there has to be a reason why you have a particular reach school. Is there something you've done? Have you done some really cool research that a college is going to look at? I mean, lots of times I like to ask a student, why do you think Stanford would consider you? And I like to make the student reflect on that and think about, well, I'm really good at this and I'm really good at that. And I want to hear something that they're really passionate about, because I think a reach school is going to look for someone very, very special in terms of who's applying. And you need to make sure, as we talked last time about the application, that the story that you tell in your application and the support you get from your school ties into that as well too, to really help you have a chance at some of these reach schools.
And that's exactly sort of the point of this language I have here. Be bold but smart. Take calculated risks based on mutual demonstrated fit, right? Whatever the cool things whatever the cool thing is that you might be referring to for the student thinking about Stanford, why is that going to matter to them? What is it that they're doing that both you and Stanford are simpatico, are mission aligned in your respective purposes on this planet, that they have to bring you in because you're going to facilitate their mission and their vision for the world and vice versa.
Yep. And in many ways, being a good person. Colleges really look at community service. They really look at what you've done to support your community and family many times. And I think kids that are going to be in good shape this coming year are kids that did really cool stuff during the COVID situation, and really, rather than sitting back and sometimes feeling sorry for themselves or just doing their schoolwork, became proactive and did things that make a difference.
One of the things that you've said over the years that I've just I've co-opted because it's so brilliant is, they want to know, that you're not just going to be a good student, but you're also going to be a good roommate.
Amen.
Things like what you're talking about, the way you spent your time during COVID, the kind of the way that you've contributed to your community, they're putting you, well, maybe not this fall, but hopefully the following falls, they're putting you in a room with somebody else.
Right.
They're putting you in a dormitory with somebody else. They're putting you in a community with somebody else. How are you going to enrich that person's experience?
Right. So hopefully this group of students who are applying this year for the following fall will have roommates and be in that situation. So yes.
So how to use research to demonstrate interest. So Michael and I did a webinar on this back on April 22nd. I had the twos in my head. And we brought up these particular points. Again, you can go onto the Kate's website, go onto the webinars page, and you can find, how to research schools online during COVID-19. And we go deeply into that. However, because there were so many questions that kind of came in through the registration forms, I wanted to simply bring this back up, which is how do you demonstrate interest during the COVID era? So number one, attend all the virtual events that you can, right? Sign up, whether it's an info session, a tour, they're tracking it, okay? Do them. Email admissions officers, email teachers, email students, show the engagement, ask questions, get people on the phone. They're actually more inclined to talk with students now, prospective students now than they were ever before, because there isn't the opportunity to go to these different campuses. Also, research Slate. Slate is a customer relations management system that universities use, and they track how long you're on their website. They're tracking you through cookies. They're tracking you through your IP address. They're using like real data and technology to make sure that you're actually engaging with the school and, hanging on their website and, doing the right research. And that's going to be really important when it comes to your application, how it's being considered, how serious you are. Also like and follow on social media, follow their Twitter, follow their Instagram, follow their Facebook, just do it, Also join the mailing list, open all the emails, and any email that they send you, click on the links. They want to see that you're engaged. And then finally, Michael alluded to this earlier, whether it's a reach, a target, and especially a foundation, show love to all of your schools. Mike, we have the Q&A coming up. Do you have anything to add before we do?
No, I think, like I say, we did a great job with this topic last time, and I think a lot of people had opened their eyes in terms of what's going on. Obviously, adding to this, hopefully schools will open up in the fall. There'll be opportunities. I know Emory and Tulane already are open for tours, in small groups or family groups. But I think you're in a situation where if you're not able to travel, if you're not able to go to some of these schools, everything we've got up here is absolutely critical. You mentioned also about emailing people. I had a student yesterday, and we were talking about, he's already been in contact with a professor who does the kind of research that he's doing in high school.
Love it.
And that's the kind, you make a connection like that,
That's
and that
cool.
Professor goes over to the admissions office and, God, I love this kid. You can rest assured at those highly, highly selective reach schools, that could be the thing that makes a difference.
Love it. So we try to go 50-50 in the Q&A and the slides.
We're not going to make it, but
it's okay. It's okay. But we're going to get into it. So Michael, there's a number of questions that have come in through the Q&A, and I think what I'm going to do is, of course, I can't see it right now. That's funny. Here, I'm going to stop this. I'm going to stop the share on this. Okay, cool. And then, so Michael, I'm going to go through the questions that came in through the registration because there's quite a few, and I'll get to the ones that are in the box. So do you think NYU and Columbia will be less competitive due to COVID this year?
Let's remember we did an entire session on this as well too, in terms of what does it all mean in terms of the application numbers. You raised something before in terms of some of the highly selective schools that don't require testing now, may all of a sudden inflate the numbers of kids applying to some of these schools because they're thinking their record is strong enough, but their testing might not have been. So I think that it's going to be just as competitive, if not more competitive, to get into some of these schools. And I've raised the issue before in terms of you might want to find out how many students a college let defer who already have spaces.
If they'll tell you. If they'll tell you. But who will already have spaces in the class the following year, and what the university will do relative to that in terms of accepting their traditional number of freshmen or their traditional number of freshmen minus some of the numbers that they're allowed to defer. Yeah, that's actually a brilliant, that's a brilliant suggestion. Just sort of asking schools, what are your plans for this? I'd be very curious to hear what they would ask. And
as you've noted, Chris, too, schools that are still taking kids off the wait list are very clear saying, you must come.
Yeah, I had a student last week who got something from Dartmouth saying, we want to keep you, or do you want to stay on the wait list? Because we're going to we might go to the wait list again. And if we do, it's only going to be to start in the fall. He'd already gotten off the wait list at Berkeley.
Mhm.
So Michael, what's the best strategy for students who are undecided on their major?
But I think that's fine. And no, I think most universities in the application process are perfectly comfortable with the student who doesn't have an intended major. There are some schools, like a Cornell, where you have to apply to the School of Engineering, the School of Arts and Science, the hotel school, the Ag and Life Science. So you do apply to a specific college. That's not the norm. Most schools, you're applying to the university and you have the ability to figure it out. The school that has either an open or even a core curriculum gives you the opportunity to figure out some things that you really might like, and that may very well be a reason why you decide what to do. And most schools don't require you to select a major until sometime in the sophomore year. So I wouldn't really worry about that issue. I think it's perfectly fine to be what we call an undeclared or undecided major in that respect.
Got it. Michael, really interesting question here about dual degree programs. How can you set yourself apart from other qualified students for a highly selective dual degree program? I'm thinking the students looking at like a pen or whatnot.
Well, I think a lot of it is also what the university allows you to do in terms of a dual degree program. For example, it is very difficult to do dual degree at Columbia, because you're already locked into doing a number of courses. And a lot of schools build in dual degrees right into their program. So I think that a student who's done, I think the other thing that we don't really talk much about here, but there's an awful lot of kids who've done college work prior to applying. And what is the school policy in terms of allowing a student to use that? Because that also gives them more ability. The school that says, all right, you've got all this credits that we're going to transfer in, but we're not going to accept the credits. We're just going to give you advanced standing, but you're going to be way ahead of other kids in terms of people that might be interested in doing a dual degree program.
So here's the thing. I understand what you're describing. I understand you to be talking about a second major. I think this student's asking about a dual degree program like the Vigellos program, life sciences, and the Wharton School coordinated dual degree program. What are or like the Huntsman program?
Yeah, I've had a couple students apply to the Huntsman program.
So how do those kids really? How do they really differentiate themselves from other people who are also like rock stars and applying?
You've got to make sure. Student that I had apply to the Huntsman program last year, fluent in Chinese, did an internship in China. So he had that kind of experience outside the United States to go into the concept that he wants to go into business later in life in terms of international business. He's already a step ahead of the typical applicant trying to apply to that. A kid applying to the hotel school at Cornell, along with another major. Make sure you've got those kinds of experiences that make you pop out in the application process, because that's how you're going to be an outstanding candidate.
It's a great answer, Michael. Thank you. Two questions here on early decision. I'm going to ask them both together. Number one, and this is a really interesting question. Well, they're all interesting, this one in particular. How should we decide which school to ED to if we don't have a favorite? That's number one. And then number two, given the difficulty of choosing a school without seeing the campus, how will that factor affect, if at all, ED admissions?
I'll do the second part first. I mean, that's the tough one. I think that unfortunately the schools that will continue to do ED this year, and like we were talking about before, nobody seems to be changing that quite yet, is that you are going to have to make that decision. And in a lot of these schools, you're not going to be able to see them. That's going to be tough. I don't think this is an easy year in terms of that. You've got to trust people in terms of former students from your school who are there, being able to reach out and talk to people on campus to make sure that any fears that you have get alleviated in that respect. So unfortunately, I don't think there's an easy answer to that one. I wish there was. The first one is a little more interesting. I've always had students come into me and say, Mr. Muska, I like school A and school B equally. Which one do I have an easier chance to? Because that's the one I'm going to go to ED at. God, I hate that. And I never ever like to even respond to that kind of question. I think a family and a student has to make a decision that if two schools are comparable, you got to decide. One of them has got a reason why you think you're going to take that school. And go back to that mirror, look at it and say, am I going to be happier at Cornell or am I going to be happier at Penn? And then try to get the answers to that rather than saying, oh, both look equal, which one should I do?
Got it. So I'll say this, and this is sort of difficult in the COVID era. A way that I often advise students to make the decision is to go and do the overnight if you can. Doing an overnight stay at the school will tell you probably what you need to know. to help you kind of make a choice, right?
Which
Because they
is
really
hard
want
to
to
do
see
right now,
research.
unfortunately.
Very
Yeah.
hard to do, right? Very hard to do. Um, okay, so moving along here, then I'm going to just sort of touch upon some of these,
Sure. Go ahead.
Michael, just to kind of like help manage time.
Yep.
So uh, schools are preparing for campus visits this fall. You know, different schools have different strategies in place. I think all schools want to have their campuses open this fall. You have to keep checking their websites. Like Michael pointed out earlier, schools like Emory, they're having students on campus right now. Universities, it seems like a lot of them, some of them at least, I know Harvard, for example, is bringing back 40% of their students
Mhm.
in the fall, which basically is going to be freshmen as well as other students who really need to be on campus in order to progress in their academics. So you
Mhm.
have to really check those websites. Question here about, does a small college in a rural area have an advantage over a larger college if a vaccine isn't available? I'd say probably yes, because those colleges in rural areas, if they have lower incidences of COVID cases, they have a bit more flexibility
Mhm.
um, to make decisions within of course, the
I'm going to
context of
probably disagree with you on. I'm going to probably disagree with you on that. I'm good
Okay.
friends with the dean at Emory. Emory
Okay,
has
go ahead. Go ahead. So the Dean of Emory, what do you say?
Emory has a phenomenal medical school right there. They
Mhm.
have the ability to test many more students than a school out in, pardon my frankness, Middlebury, which may not have a hospital any place nearby, and it is
Mhm.
much more difficult to be able to test their students on a regular basis. So I think a college that has a very strong medical presence could be at an advantage this year in terms of the ability to have their students be safer.
Yeah, assuming that those resources are there, yes.
Mhm.
I wasn't even thinking about the medical school aspect, which of course is a brilliant point, Michael. I'm thinking simply about just like basically social distancing,
Sure.
physical
Yep.
distancing. But Michael, financial aid question: will public colleges have the money to support a four-year degree?
Well, I think that, the commitment of financial aid is really done over a 4-year belief. So I don't think that there's an issue in terms of one of the issues that was coming up in California was the fact that they liked full pay internationals and full pay students from out of state because that helped create more financial aid dollars for them. I think it will be tougher on state universities based on funding from the states. And we're
Hmm.
seeing some states be a little bit tighter on their budgets. I mean, we're hearing the governor of New York really concerned about the kind of money that he's going to be able to budget in terms of different programs across the state. Will it impact financial aid? It could. I don't think there's a simple answer to that. The economy is not in great shape in a lot of states right now. A lot of people, however, are going to need financial aid who never used to need financial aid. So I think you have to look at what are the situations available in those situations. Private universities may be a little better off that are highly endowed, that still have the resources to fund all students fully.
Michael, I'm going to go to the live chat thread because we're coming up on 3 o'clock here Eastern. Um, uh, how do you fit in specialized schools such as the Berkeley School of Music?
Well, I think obviously, there are two parts of it. Most of the specialized schools are going to still have auditions, and they're going to have to figure out if they can't do in-person auditions, what they're going to have to do virtually. And some schools have done virtual auditions for a number of years. So it's not something new in terms of that. So I think that that's one piece. Another piece that I tell students to think about is on the back page of their common application where it says, is there anything else you'd like to add? I've encouraged students over the years to put links to different things that they want schools to see. Could be a YouTube video, could be a performance that they were doing. But having those links there can really help with a specialized school. But I think the reality is for specialized school, talent is still going to be the thing that's most important to those schools.
Right. There's a question in the chat thread about where they can watch previous webinars. We appreciate the fact that you're enjoying this. So you go to katestutoring.com or just Google Kate's Tutoring, and then on our events tab here, right, you'll go down to webinars, and that brings you to this page I was showing right here. We're currently doing this webinar. We're in the middle of it, or at the end of it rather. But over here under past webinars, you can see ones that we've done recently, how to navigate the Common App might be of interest to you, COVID-19, the college waitlist, how to research colleges online. It was on 429, not 422. That's the one where we go deeply into how to research colleges online, especially in the COVID era, which also helps you understand some of the other questions that are on here. How to differentiate different colleges. When you can only see them online, we talk about best practices for that, as well as which schools are right for you. Also, we talk about a number of other things that are here in the Q&A, which is it necessary to visit schools? We talk about that in that particular webinar. Again, this 429 webinar. And then there's a few more questions here, Michael, with respect to some testing. If I were to do the SAT at the end of September, the results might not be available then before deadline of early November. If I need to attach them, do you have any solutions in advance? The question here, Michael, is if I'm taking the exam late and I'll have the results back, what do I do? What you do is when you get the results, you send an email to the school with a screenshot, letting them know that you have new test results. You want them to be added to your profile, and then also, of course, send it directly from College Board to the university.
I've oftentimes tell them to ask their guidance counselor to send it and sign it.
Beautiful.
Okay.
Genius. That's a genius. Michael, is there any difference in assessment of scores for international students versus US students? I'm thinking this is coming from an international student who wants to know if they have any sort of leeway with test scores compared to a US student.
Well, I think this is going to be a really weird year, okay? In terms of the fact that, I was in college admissions for a long time. Boy, without test scores, I would be very challenged in terms of how I might evaluate an application. So I think it's going to really depend on who in that admissions office understands the international transcript that student is submitting, and I still think that the ability to take a TOEFL, the ability to take the SAT or the ACT if you can, will help you stick out in that international pool. So I try to do it if you can.
Beautiful, love it. That's everything that's in the Q&A. There is one thing that's come in through the chat, which I do want to get to, and it's an interesting question. What should students with IEPs, not extreme, look at when assessing schools? And PS, and where is that information located? Michael?
I think a lot of that is reaching out directly to schools. There are a lot of schools. American University is one that immediately comes to mind, that is very sensitive to students who have had these kinds of programs and experiences. Because you also want to make sure that school is going to be able to accommodate the needs of that student in the college situation. So I think that it's very important to develop that relationship with different schools to see what services they offer and how it will impact. At an American university, I've been told it could actually help a student in the admissions process because they are looking for students that they want in that program. I know Marist College is a school that has a similar program. Go out there and look for schools that have those programs. You can find them, but I think the typical university may be a little bit not as supportive as some other places. So see what they can do.
Yeah, if you have questions on that, you're welcome to email us directly because we've had a number of students who've gone through that process. Michael, here, a few more questions coming in. People are still with us. Would full-paying students have a better chance at admissions this year?
I don't know. It's going to depend on the school. I think the Ivy League school is not going to matter, okay? I think to a school that's a little bit more down the food chain could be a real factor. So I think in terms of thinking about where you can help yourself, yes. But again, like I say, the schools that have the huge endowments, they're still not going to, it's not going to be a plus in those situations.
We've got another question here, Michael. How does testing apply when you're applying to schools, overseas or abroad? Are there things that schools look for, that are different than the U.S. process?
I think what's going to be really interesting this year is historically schools like Oxford and Cambridge wanted to see what your SATs were. What subject tests did you take? What APs did you take? It's going to be bewildering to me what they're going to be able to use for testing criteria with the lack of testing that exists in a lot of places right now. So I think there could be a real change in terms of how they have to look at applicants just for that reason.
Yeah, well, they're going to have to. And this is sort of interesting. Like, it's amazing how many other sort of entities or bodies are using testing in different ways. So like, for example, I know that the Israeli military happens to use the SAT subject tests as a factor when they're, making decisions on, how well fit you are to do some, certain certain jobs. So it's amazing how all these different kind of places use standardized testing, and with standardized testing kind of going away, at least for this year, there are going to be some new decisions and some new systems. Michael, we have, with the exception of one last question, it's our question. I'm not sure if this person's on the call, but what are the prospects of CPB student? So like Chris, Paul, Betty, what are the prospects of a CPB student in the college search and admissions process? We didn't understand what the CPB meant. We looked at Customs Border Patrol. We looked at
we thought chemistry, physics, biology.
Chemistry, physics, and biology. We had a couple of things going on. If you are on the session registering, please clarify. We're very happy to help you. But we're bringing this back. This has been a very popular program here. Oh, you know what, Michael? We may have. Let's see if we have over here. Okay, great. It means lowest college prep classes. Michael.
Lowest college prep classes.
Yeah, it means lowest. It means the lowest college prep classes. So what are the prospects for a CPB student in the college search and admissions process? So a student who's been in the lowest college prep classes. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is going to be, I use this line many times. A student is going to be judged on, number one, what their high school offers. For example, there are a lot of high schools who don't offer honors and AP classes, and they're going to be judged on that. I think a student who's in a school that offers a lot of those classes, yes, it's going to be at a disadvantage. So you've got to look at what does the college look for in terms of that. But again, progress over time, showing that a student who worked, was initially started in some classes that might not have been as challenging, but then takes on more challenging classes, it could be looked at in a very, very positive light as well, too.
Well, thank you for the clarification. We have now made ourselves whole with all the questions that have come in, the questions that we've had for the audience. Again, we are offering for webinar attendees a save 50% promotion offer. If you want to do a 2-hour admission strategy session, either with Michael, me, or somebody else in our team, if you want to design your school list so it aligns with your career goals, talk about your application narrative and your hook, create an admission strategy for a particular school, give feedback on your essays and application materials, or discuss any questions with an expert on admissions, you're welcome to give us a ring. And if you use the code EDGE50, so that's E as in Edward, D as in David, G as in Gary, E as in Elizabeth, 50. If you're on the webinar attendee list, which we have, and you use this code, you're eligible to get a half off on a consult. So hopefully that's of use and help to you. Michael, I'm just going to kind of say thank you and goodbye. Would love to know, Michael, is any sort of parting shots you have regarding, what students should be doing as they're making their school selection list?
Chris, you used the word several times in this session, fit. I think the concept of finding a school where you're going to fit in and most importantly, be happy. I think the criteria for success in college isn't the name of the school, it isn't the courses that are offered. It's a place where you're going to fit in and be happy.
And I'll simply say, remember, you're going to be there for 4 years. So you want to be there for 4 years.
And prepare for the next 60.
There you go. And Michael, with that, thank you very much. Thank you to our viewing audience. Good luck, be well, be safe. In 2 weeks, we'll be doing another webinar on how to craft a winning personal essay and college essay supplements. Hope to see you then. Take care.
Okay, great. Take care. Bye-bye.